On Spotlight this weekend, we will continue our focus on the US elections and what the legal hurdles mean for Trump and for Biden. Joining me to discuss this is yet again James Sample, professor at Hofstra Law School. James, thank you so much for joining us yet again on World Today. Let's begin by understanding what the legal hurdles for either side could really mean. Beginning with Donald Trump, the fact that we're looking at now a Supreme Court hearing, the case going into trial, is disqualification in any way a possibility?
Well, disqualification, and Geeta, it's great to be back with you again. Disqualification is not really an option because, believe it or not, in the United States, even if Mr. Trump were to be convicted of a felony, and he's facing 91 separate felony charges over 4 criminal cases, even if he were convicted and even in a hypothetical scenario where he were imprisoned, he would still not be prevented under the Constitution from running for the presidency and even holding the presidency, in theory, even while incarcerated. But short of disqualification, the legal troubles that he's facing are substantial. The first of his criminal cases to go to trial will be going to trial in 3 weeks, March 25th in New York. But the Supreme Court, as you mentioned, has taken up this argument that at least with respect to the January 6th effort to overturn the results of the 2020 election and the insurrection and the charges against Mr. Trump related to that insurrection, the Supreme Court is going to consider his argument, Mr. Trump's argument, that he is, quote, absolutely immune from prosecution. That is an argument that has failed. It failed in the trial court. It failed in the appellate court. But the Supreme Court, by taking it up, has done Donald Trump a huge favor because they have delayed the possible start date for a trial, even if they were to rule against Mr. Trump, which seems likely on the argument that he's immune. It's unlikely that they will find that he's absolutely immune. That would be remarkable and unprecedented in the U.S., but it will delay the start of a trial, probably until after the election.
I was just going to ask you that. You think the spillover will be beyond November? And if that, how does that make or increase Trump's chances of fighting or giving that good fight that he wants to give should he become the Republican candidate, which most likely is the case post the Super Tuesday primaries?
It's the right question to ask, Edith, without a doubt. And I think that the answer is that it absolutely increases his likelihood of success. Polls are of questionable reality or validity. We don't always know, but polls show that the difference between Donald Trump running just as a candidate charged with crimes and Donald Trump running as a candidate if he were to be convicted of crimes is about 7 points in the polls, a swing to Donald Trump if he's only charged and a swing to President Biden if Mr. Trump is convicted. So the likelihood is that those swing voters, those voters who are in the middle and who tend to make up the determining votes in a U.S. election, are taking seriously the idea that if he were convicted, it would be a significant factor in their decision making. It's not that the Supreme Court's decision won't come out until November. It probably will come out. They're hearing argument in late April. They'll probably decide by June. But the problem is then the sort of calendar and the sequence, the dominoes that need to fall in order for the January 6th case to be tried prior to the election. It's still conceivable. It's just very, very unlikely.
Well, there's a huge difference in how the American system works as opposed to how systems work here in India. And a lot of viewers here, James, are interested in US elections, but can't seem to grapple and wrap their heads around how the system really works. I have a question for you. Our viewers would certainly want to know. He has been debarred. Trump has been debarred from or has been removed from the ballot in 3 states. And yet he is the front runner in the Republican primaries. How does that really work? And should he continue to be off the ballot, then how does that presidential race really work for the Republicans?
It's a great question. First, I think that there's a pretty good likelihood that he will ultimately end up on the ballot in those states. So Colorado, most prominently, just this week, Illinois, have ruled that he's not qualified, not eligible to be on the ballot because he participated in an insurrection. There's a clause in the U.S. Constitution that sets out a requirement that somebody who is a candidate for federal office have never engaged in an insurrection. That being said, it appears quite likely that the Supreme Court is going to overturn those decisions. He will likely be on the ballot. But even if he were ultimately not to appear on the ballot in the states where he's been removed, because of the U.S. system of what they call the Electoral College, in which each of the separate states, each of the separate districts around the country are allocated sort of proportional, almost proportional votes rather than a popular vote where it's just how many votes did each candidate get. The likelihood is so far Mr. Trump has not been disqualified from a ballot in a state that he would have been expected to win. So far, the consequences of those disqualifications in those states are A, uncertain to continue, and B, even if they were, unlikely to be consequential.
Right. Again, a very important question, James, would be that the fact that there are guidelines that limit prosecutorial action in politically sensitive investigations, I'm told, from within 60 days of an election, which really means that prosecutors have to face a deadline of early September?
Yes, although this is certainly, I mean, that's correct. And if this were a normal election cycle, and if this were a normal set of charges, I think that practice, it's not really a law so much as it's a policy and procedure that's practiced by the Federal Department of Justice in the U.S. This I'm not sure qualifies, in part because particularly related to the charges growing out of 2020's attempt to overturn the election, the entire centerpiece of those charges, of that incident, of that scenario, was to thwart the will of the people. And if the people aren't able to prosecute the president in the time frame between that election and the next one, then there's the potential of two elections, in essence, being threatened by the illegal actions of one man. So I suspect that the Department of Justice, and they have put a lot of resources. The special counsel, Jack Smith, has put a lot of resources into investigating, into getting cooperating witnesses, and into preparing for trial. They want very much to go to trial before the election because in a scenario where Donald Trump is not tried before the election and then wins the presidency, he will make sure to shut down the investigation so he'll never have to stand trial. And if he's somehow convicted and still wins election, he will likely pardon himself. So
right.
if the American people want there to be legal consequences for the things that Mr. Trump has allegedly engaged in, there needs to be a trial before the election. Otherwise, there will never be accountability.
That's a very, very interesting point to make, James. But again, we've seen Donald Trump's statements, his speeches, and in many occasions, he has mentioned how the judges in the Supreme Court are on his side. That really has not gone down well with judges within the Supreme Court. How will that really work for him when the case goes to trial?
Well, I think before the Supreme Court, he has a structural advantage. Despite being president for only one term, only for 4 years, he appointed 3 of the 9 members of the Supreme Court, and there are 3 other members of the Supreme Court who are predisposed in many instances to agree with him ideologically, including Justice Clarence Thomas, whose wife, Ginny Thomas, was an active participant in the events of January 6th. And so there's a sense among many legal observers in the United States that the Supreme Court taking up this case and further delaying the possibility of trial is political payback, and that they are returning the favor of his appointments. That's not a great optic. It doesn't look very good. It doesn't square with what America tries to export as its reputation around the world for a place that is governed by the rule of law, but it may very well be the reality.
Right. And finally, before I let you go, we have spoken and discussed Trump in detail, but there's legal hassles and hurdle for President Biden as well. The Hunter Biden case, particularly so, James, he deposed in front of the before the Congress, and under oath has said quite vehemently that his father has never benefited partially or fully or participated in any of his work. Now, while he has already deposed and he's already spoken under oath, where do you see the difficulties that lie ahead for President Biden, sorry?
Sure. No, I think that the Hunter Biden investigation and the entire milieu that the Republican Party has created around the president's son, who has made some clearly made some mistakes and has had a checkered past in many respects. However, has not in any way, shape, or form yet been tied to the president himself. The investigative committee has done all it can do and has it's sort of reached a point where it's kind of time to, in the phrase "put up or shut up." They have not come up with any concrete evidence that is tying the president to any illegal activities or even any influence peddling. And most prominently, over the last couple of weeks, it has been discovered that the quote unquote star witness for the prosecution or for the investigation into Hunter Biden was actually an FBI informant who, it turns out, has been indicted and is now in prison, awaiting. He's trying to get released, but he's being charged with, in essence, serving as a conduit for Russian disinformation, and that he has recanted some of his allegations. And so without that star witness, it doesn't really seem like there is a there, so to speak, in terms of the charges against President Biden or the allegations against President Biden. That's not to say that Hunter Biden has acted perfectly, but there's no indication that despite being a father, Joe Biden has anything to do with it.
But what do you make of the opinion where a court had said that they don't deem President Biden fit to really come and testify, questioning his capabilities, mental capacity? Is that grounds for disqualification at all? And could that be used? Because we do know Trump is using it.
It'll be used as a political cudgel. It will be used by Mr. Trump in the campaign, and certainly the age of the president has been an issue. The special counsel's report, which found that President Biden was not responsible for any criminal wrongdoing and was not to be prosecuted, included those sort of extraneous statements. They were contrary to Department of Justice policy, but were nonetheless included. They are very powerful as a political and rhetorical weapon against him, but there's no grounds for disqualifying President Biden from running for office because of the impressions about his age. At the end of the day, the comparison is between two candidates, both of whom are relatively elderly by the standards of American presidents, and one of whom is facing 91 felony indictments, and the other of whom has been a relatively competent, if a bit elderly, president.
Well, James Sample, we'll have to wait and see how things turn out for Trump in the primaries. And it certainly seems like this is going to be a big fight between Biden and Trump. We will keep asking you to return and explain to us what the legal hassles that they would be facing could mean for the presidential race. Thank you so much for joining us here on World Today.
Thank you, Geeta.